everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our lecture series. It's part of our Made in Miami series. My name is Delis, and I'm the executive director here at Miami Design Preservation League. You'll see here on the screen, we have our upcoming lectures. On May 16th, we have Joel Levine presenting Lost Treasures of Sunny Isles. And then on May 30th, we have Bill Wisser, who is doing Doorways in Paradise, about the Art Deco doors of Miami Beach. So it's going to be a very interesting series of lectures. I also wanted to mention on May 17th, we are having our annual meeting and our preservation awards, which we haven't done since, I think, 2003. So that's going to be at the Wolfsonian Museum. So please come to that. That's at the Wolfsonian, May 17th, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. We also have our Lincoln Road Tour, which happens to be tomorrow. It's once a week. It meets at the Albion Hotel. It's free for members, starting at 11 a.m. Do we have any tour guides in the audience? Raise your hand. Thank you all. And of course, our famous Art Deco walking tours. It's every day at 10:30, and on Thursdays it's at 6:30 as well. So this is our Made in Miami lecture series. If you're not a member, please go online to mdpl.org/join, and you can easily become a member and support all of our great programs. So without further ado, we're very honored to have Paul Kaplan, who has flown here all the way from New York City today to give this talk. And Paul writes under 3 series: Jewish Cultural Guides, Social History and Biographies, and Business Marketing. He's been featured on the front page of New York Press, the long-running radio show America's Dining and Travel, the iconic African-American newspaper Amsterdam, New York, and Princeton Magazine. And he has earned his BA in Ethics, Politics, and Economics from Yale College and an MBA from Yale School of Management. He is an avid traveler, has visited 6 continents, 46 states, and he's also worked in marketing for over 15 years. So we're very excited to have him here, and please let's give him a round of applause. Thank you. Okay, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
All right, great. So it's great to be here with you. Thanks to all of you for coming out. I think we're gonna learn a lot tonight and hopefully have some fun as well. So I just flew down from New York City just for this event to be with you. That's how much I like and support the effort. And just like a lot of you who are volunteers, it's a lot of for me, this authorship is very much a labor of love. And like so many of you do, it's about, what I'm trying to do is preserve and promote and illuminate a lot of the cultural history and architectural history, which I know a lot of you can appreciate. So let's talk a little bit about today's presentation. Let me just go back here. So what I'm going to do is just give a quick overview of the book. We already got kind of a background on me. Then we'll talk a little bit about the history of Jews in South Florida, and we'll talk about some of the historic neighborhoods, synagogues, and memorials. Talk about some eateries, which everyone always likes to do. And then I have a book actually that just came out, which is a biography on a social and healthcare reformer, which I tie a little bit to some of in a way like Paul Kaplan tried to do. So I'll mention that for about 5 minutes or so, 5 to 10 minutes at the end. Then we'll do a Q&A. So if you can, just hold your questions to the end, and then we'll do some signings on the other side, that lovely table on the other side of this wall. And we'll do signings for, I actually have New York book, which I brought, a lot of you like New York, and of course the Florida book, which we'll be talking about, as well as this biography, which I'll mention a little bit. So just a lot of things kind of coming out. So let me provide, I'm going to kind of have to do this, an overview of the book. So it's a cross-genre of history and travel, and summarizes the history of Jews in South Florida. And it's really about trying to tell the story behind sites. So this is about some of the anecdotes, it's original quotes from curators, shop owners, tour guides. There's a section that I call snapshot profiles, where I talk about significant
people involved. So it kind of gives that richness and that fabric. And it was published, all these books are published from Pelican, just sort of a large independent publisher. So the author, so you know about this. I think what's important to know here is my website. So you can kind of keep in touch after this, paulkaplanauthor.com. You can see some of the events and media interviews. There's a blog. You can contact me. Also social media, for those of you who do that. Follow on Facebook, Twitter. So that gives you like some idea about what I'm doing here. The book series, as was mentioned before, so I kind of talk about it in like 3 different series. So there's the Jewish cultural guides, which we're going to talk about today. There's what I call social history and biographies. So this is, I'm going to talk a little about Lily Wald. Penn Station, that has a whole history, and that's coming out in about a year, which is about the architecture of Penn Station and how it was torn down in the 1960s. And something about urban Berlin. And there's also a business marketing book as well coming out in the next year. Okay, so also some media interviews, on radios, if you're interested in that, America's Dining and Travel, and some talk shows as well, like with nonfiction books. So with that, let's kind of delve into the history of Jews in South Florida. So the first thing to say is that it's a medley of cultures. So sometimes people not familiar with this area, you of course are and you live here, but they tend to think maybe of like just the snowbirds when we're talking about some of the cultural aspects of Jews in South Florida. But we're trying to talk about a larger landscape here. So this will involve some of the Cuban experience, some of the Sephardic, and really coming from Spain, other Latin American. This also was a big area for Holocaust survivors. So that's one piece. We want to think about it in this wide scope. Also, that I mentioned that it wasn't all the urban experience that we tend to think of in terms of like a lot of Jewish immigration, but a lot in terms of the rural and farmers. And we'll see later in the presentation how important merchants were, and that a lot of a very high percentage of the first Jews who settled in Miami were merchants. Okay. So let's start from the beginning, and we'll just kind of do the history somewhat quickly. But in 1763, we have the first documented Jews in Florida from New Orleans. Why is that? Anyone know? And by the way, I'm going to make this interactive. So you have to hold your questions, but I'm going to ask you questions. So we'll make it kind of fun. And I know a lot of you know a lot about all this, so this is your chance to kind of shine a little bit. So why? Why did they come from New Orleans? What does that have to do with this? What happened in 1763? Right, French and Indian War. Right, very good. See, don't you guys know your stuff.
Answer?
So as the gentleman in the front row pointed out, it was the French and Indian War, the conclusion. So in 1763, Spain lost Florida to the more religiously tolerant British with the Treaty of Paris of the French-Indian War, and Spain gains Louisiana. So basically, there were feared restrictions that some Jews decided to relocate to what became non-Spanish areas. So there were 3 Sephardic Jews, itinerant merchants, resettling from New Orleans to Pensacola, and one was Salmon, who may have been related to Solomon from the Revolutionary War. And in 1783, though, the Spanish regained control of Florida. And so when that happens, what happens when Spain regains control of Florida? It becomes less tolerant again, and a few Jews leave for other states. So that's kind of the beginning when we think about this state. From around 1780 to 1820, we don't have that much documented history at all about Jews in specifically Florida, as we think of it. Okay, so let's kind of now go to 1820 when we have a little bit more documented history. So, have you heard of Moses Levy?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so some of you are familiar. So, Moses Levy was an interesting character in the Virgin Islands. He makes a fortune in the lumber business because the demand was soaring for that. So if you think about this time in history, there was a sort of move towards utopias, and he decides to start a utopia in the countryside with a blacksmith shop, a sugar mill, stable, corn houses, for about 5 Jewish families. He provides the housing, the clothing, the food. And unusual, he actually called for the abolition of slavery and open schools. And it lasts about 13 years. So how do you think it ends? Why does it only last 13 years? What happens?
Civil War.
Right, exactly. So because of the Seminole War, the plantation is destroyed, and then his son, David Levy, becomes the first U.S. Jewish senator. Okay, now the son has a totally different political philosophy than his father. His son is really more aligned to like the typical Southern, somewhat rural politics at the time. So becoming the first Jewish U.S. senator, he was pro-slavery, he was for secession rights, and he aligned with a lot of white Southern agricultural interests. Okay, so now I have a question for you. Going to early Miami, so a few decades later, what innovation opened up to South Florida? Because so far we're just talking about Florida. South Florida is mostly Indians and swampland. Yes?
Florida East Coast Railway.
Right, and who was the person who was behind a lot of that?
A little fellow by the name of Flagler.
Right, great. So in 1894 to 95, Henry Flagler continues the expansion of this railway. He already had done some of that. But the key thing is, in the mid-1890s, expanded it to Miami, and in doing so, it starts to bring to life this area, right? Because it was largely uninhabited, it was largely uninhabited. Now, Key West. What about Key West? Key West, before all this, was a very important port economically in decades before. A lot of you know that. So what happens? This is my question to you. When the railroad comes, does it make Key West more important, the same, or less important? Less. Why do you say less? Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly as you guys said. Well, you're all going to get an A in this class. Okay, I'll repeat the answer. So, as pointed out by many people in the audience, first of all, so Henry Flagler's Railway, as we talked about, but Key West, as you guys said, it was a very important port, but once you had the railway coming into South Florida and you started to have the movement of goods on land, it became less important as a port city. And you start to see some of the migration of both people and economics from that area. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the first Jewish settlers. So are you guys familiar with these? Jake Schneidman and Ida and Isadora Cohen? No? Okay. Some of you? Good. Well, you'll become a little familiar. So Schneidman moves in 1896, right? Now you have the railway. It's still just budding Miami. You don't have forget Miami Beach. I'm just talking about Miami. And he opens his new shop, which is dry goods and clothing. So Isadora Cohen moves from New York City, and he writes a book, which I, in terms of writing this, find very helpful because I can get primary sources to tell you what it looked like. And it's called Historical Sketches and Sidelights of Miami, Florida. So what he writes in the book is, I have a quote for you. He writes, "Miami looks like a real town. We have a city hall, jail, water, and lane systems. Our merchants are doing a good business, derived from the railway employees." So historians believe that Jews own 75% of the first 16 retail stores. So, in 1912, Lewis's wife dies, and there's no congregation ceremony. So, he's one of the congregants of what become B'nai Zion. So his wife dies, and there's no congregation cemetery for it. So this first congregation was very like shoestring, and it was very like kind of making do with what they had. But when there's no cemetery for her remains, the wife of this gentleman I was telling you about, it kind of dawns on them that they need to formalize. So they decide they take the remains to Jacksonville, but B'nai Zion was founded. So it became official. Now B'nai Zion, 4 years later, it became Temple David, after David Aframo of the New York bargain store. So you see here like some of the, what I'm talking about, some of the visuals. Okay, so now to talk about and we'll talk more about the synagogue a little later and what happened with that and how it eventually broke off into something else in Miami. So, but kind of continuing with this history, we'll get back to that congregation. So, Miami Beach, 1913, it was wild terrain to be domesticated, few knew of the island. I think a lot of you are very familiar with the very early history, but we have this quote here about the wild strip of sandline, the dunes and forests, reptile-infested mangrove swamp. And John Collins sees great agricultural potential, but he tends to be a little bit more utilitarian in his vision. Like he sees it as a place that might make sense for some kind of agriculture and business proposition. But Carl Fisher really is more the brander. He's about branding the island. What is Carl Fisher famous for? What did he do prior? One of the most iconic sporting events?
Indianapolis 500.
Indianapolis 500. So he's from Indianapolis, and he was part of this whole thing about automobiles, and it eventually grew into Indy 500. So he sees this as a tourist destination for the rich and famous. He has a lot of visionary ideas for it, and there start becoming some of the casinos, which we know are not casinos like are talked about today, but the restaurants and pools, where you can do swimming and having like a change room. So this was kind of moving ahead now, sort of like became the shtetl by the sea once it started to get more populated. Okay, so we do see that there was some discrimination, unfortunately, with different groups. And so and when I've spoken to different audiences, a lot of them have actually sort of commented about this and some of their memories of some of the discrimination things among Jews and blacks and other groups as well. But Life Below Fifth Street was this interesting kind of like shtetl by the sea. It's been, Isaac Singer remarked about of Fifth Street, here the sound of the old world was alive as ever. It was shtetl by the sea. And so most Jews lived below Fifth Street. There were kosher butchers, there were synagogues. Surveys that I've seen reveal that about 55% of hotels in Florida excluded Jewish patrons, though in Miami Beach, that percentage was definitely much lower. But in the mid-1920s, you have a huge run-up in land prices amid the price speculation. And this is something that we kind of see all over in many parts of the country at this time, and it's partly fueled by cheap capital. By cheap capital, yeah. So there was also this Binder Boys, like the Binder Boys are, if you could just hold the questions, I have to ask you to do that because we have a lot to get through. But I'll have questions at the end. So the Binder Boys literally had these binders of different information. And it was kind of a scam, basically. I mean, in so many words, just to kind of cut to the chase. Because they would inflate prices and sell things, and in a lot of ways echoes of exactly what a bubble is, and then sort of the buzz that comes from that. So these are some of the old pictures that I found, by the way, that you might find interesting of at this period that I was able to license for this. Okay, so then the area comes to an abrupt halt. Why? What stops the area's development?
Hurricane.
The hurricane of what year? And then what we see is that there's sort of about the hurricane. The myth, what people who are not clear on, is they think that this area had a downturn with the stock market crash and the depression. you, of course, are very familiar with it all and know that that really isn't true. It started 3 years before when the market was doing great from the hurricane. So then, though you did have the market crash and the Great Depression, this area was affected, but not as much as other areas like New York. But it was revitalized by the Army base in World War II. So the area, the Army decided to put the Army base here and put Miami Beach on the map. So I have quotes that say the Army took over 85% of Miami Beach hotels with many Air Force officer candidates and enlisted men training at Miami Beach. So do you know what this picture is? Does anyone know what that is? It's what?
A lunch counter?
Yeah.
McCrory's.
It's Al's Sandwich Shop from the 1940s. And it's on, I think, Commons and...
Fifth and Washington.
That's not where this was, though, according to my
That's
picture.
not else.
Yeah. This was, like, further up from here, several blocks up. Okay, so I think you're kind of familiar with this. So in the 1950s, there's like what they call the 3 A's that really were making this area much more robust. What were the 3 A's? What really transformed this area?
Air conditioning.
Air conditioning? Airplanes? And automobile. You guys are like really into your stuff. So this is a picture I found of Miami Beach, the Army base that was happening right in the early 1940s. So, but anyway, in the 50s, you have these 3. But lower income residents did not always enjoy all these things, like some of the air conditioning. So you start to see some of that bifurcation economically and social income-wise. So, let's see, Broward and Palm Beach County. So, okay. So, do you know Harry and Florence Brown from St. Louis? They were among the first Jews to reside in Boca Raton. And I have a quote that I found from them, which kind of gives flavor for how rural that area was. They said it was a time when it was still possible to sit in the middle of Old Dixie Highway and play cards. So it's pretty funny. So there's also there was the Hutkins Food Market, Temple Bethel, one of the first Jewish congregations in Boca Raton. There was Clematis Street. So I tried to find what were the old Jewish downtown areas in these areas. So for this part, it was where a lot of Jews started retail stores, including a hat store, men's shop, there was a luggage business. And in Broward County, the oldest Temple Emmanuel actually began in a rented room on Andrews Avenue in Fort Lauderdale. And I tried to find it. I actually went to this
abandoned house, and I looked, I think I found it, and it's in where the room would have been. And that, of course, has developed to a whole new temple, which we'll talk about later. So there's also the Sterling Men's and Boys Store as one of the first Jewish retailers in Fort Lauderdale. Okay, so let me just also point out that, about the Stranahans, the first residents in the early 1900s. You know the Stranahan house in Fort Lauderdale? Okay, so you're familiar with that. And there's a lot in that area, which we won't have time to get into today, about Mo and Matt Katz, and they're buried in the cemetery that I talk about. And they were really like the pioneers of this area in many ways. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about historic neighborhoods and synagogues. So you're all familiar with the Jewish Museum of Florida, right? Are you all pretty familiar with it? Should we skip over this? Okay. I want to tailor this to your needs. So if you're, a lot of the Miami Beach stuff I think you're going to know. You all pretty much know it, right? And you know the history of it. Well, I mean, just very quickly, it was founded in 1927. There's a thriving congregation of Beth Jacob. And again, most Jews could not live or stay in hotels north of 5th Street. So this structure was, was built as a synagogue. Prior to that, they had to travel across the bay for worship. And as the congregation grew, and Art Deco, as you all know, is the rage, they built a larger building. And next door at 301 Washington, and that was designated as as part of it. And this was, of course, none other than Henry Hollhauser. And this was an early work that would become part of his prolific career. So today, there's the aqueducts, the women's balcony, and they tried an architectural trick. What was kind of innovative about it, since a lot of you know architecture? What did they do? That's right, a sloped floor, exactly, so that you could be able to see. And there was also air conditioning, so there's all kinds of stories I read about the windows being open and fights about that. I'll skip over some of the later history about it because I think you're familiar for time. But basically, the area fell into a lot of decline in the 1970s and 80s, and congregates were moving away, and that did impact the congregation here. And then Hurricane Andrew also destroyed the roof, and later became the Jewish Museum. So lots more to say on that. You're probably all pretty familiar with the Holocaust Memorial here, but a few things about it. It's, just so we're all clear, it's a memorial to the Holocaust, which they're very clear about. It's not a museum. And I interviewed the curator there, and what she said is that, this is a quote, "Most have no cemetery to visit those family members who perished in the Holocaust. This is holy ground. It is a place to pay respects to those who died." So it's very different from a lot of the way we think about Holocaust museums around the country. And you really feel a lot of that sort of sanctimony there. So it began with an idea in 1984, and was the community generally in favor of it? Would you say? Was pretty much everyone on board with it in 1984? No one's ever on board with everything. So we know that, right? Especially now, but it's always been like that. So not all agreed. Some did not like this idea at all, and I actually read through some of the minutes, and they said, this is Miami Beach, it should be fun in the sun, we don't need to have like a memorial about this very serious historic thing, and we oppose it. So the gloom is, this is the quote that I found, "Gloom is doomed. Don't turn one of the city's few bright spots into a cemetery." So you see, you always have this sort of back and forth. But the advocates pleaded their case to the Miami Beach Planning Board in the mid-'80s, and it was approved unanimously. There's, have you guys I'm sure you've been there many times, right? Now, the architect, Ken Treister, reflected on how victims probably thought that no one would care about them and their plight. So one thing to note is that he looked for a design to capture the public attention, right? Like it is, you really notice it. It's kind of, now some would say, critics would say over the top, but what I'm inferring from what he wrote, he would say, well, yeah, that's the whole point. I want to show that there is a lot of attention around this. So that's something to note about that. And if you ever have a group of 10, by the way, they can have you meet with survivors, and they can put together a program for you. So I think that's good to know. Okay, so you're familiar with the Cuban Hebrew Synagogue, right? And this is personified as the event of a lot of the Jewish Cuban refugees fleeing to Florida in the early 1960s. So I think what was important here, and what I read a lot about, is a lot of these Cuban Jews did not feel welcome when they came. And they felt like they were really on their own. So in September 1961, the Cuban Hebrew Circle of Miami adopted in the Lutheran Hotel, and they tried to kind of find ways of making this community ease their way here. So there were a bunch of different moves, which I won't get into, but I think what's important is that they advocated and helped settle Cuban refugees. They also hosted a table, which I have a picture of, at the Opa-locka airport to greet refugees coming from Cuba. They had a lot of rituals there from Cuba, like 100-year-old Torah, prayer cat, Talib from Havana, and in the early 1980s, with the refugees of the Mariel boatlets, that this really kind of flew into action in terms of some of their advocacy, which we can talk about another time. Okay, so I'll kind of go through a little bit more quickly. Are you all familiar with that? No? Okay. So this is the Sephardic tradition. It's the culture is connected to Spain. Now, when I interviewed the rabbi here, he was very specific about this. He said people misuse, in his opinion, people misuse the word Sephardic. It's kind of this general thing. He said, no, this is, my congregation is very connected to Spain. Some of the prayers are in Ladino. It started in the 1960s. The Temple Moses, by Orthodox Cuban refugees. A lot of the ancestry is from Turkey and Cuba. And one of the quotes that I have from the rabbi is, he says, this is the genuine community of Judeo-Spanish. Their culture is connected to that of Spain. This congregation maintained the food, culture, heritage, songs, and others of their Spanish ancestry.
Where is it? 71st Street.
Yeah, right.
So between this and the last slide, some of the Cuban refugees were Ashkenazi and some
Right.
were Sephardic.
That's exactly right. So the Cuban refugees were both Ashkenazi and Sephardic. It's absolutely true. Because that's what a lot of it really is as it mirrors in Cuba. But for this particular temple, we're talking about the Sephardic parts of that. So it's very interesting. Like the services are in English, Hebrew, and Ladino. Are you familiar with what Ladino is?
No.
Okay, for those of you who don't, it's kind of like Yiddish is to Ashkenazi, as Ladino is to Sephardic. So it was spoken in the Ottoman Empire territories. And still today, like, you know, certain literature, just like you would learn Yiddish, like there's certain literature, certain plays that are written in that. And they also have like food that I mentioned here, like in relation to that. So I thought this was an interesting example from something that we usually think about. Okay, so then I wanted to mention a little bit about early Miami neighborhoods. Are you familiar with Shenandoah and Riverside?
Yes.
Okay, so in researching this book, I really wanted to find, like, what were these downtowns? So I went to this downtown, I hired a professor from the local community college to kind of quote him and give a tour. And what I found is that Riverside and Shenandoah were these largely Jewish middle-class neighborhoods from like the 1920s to 50s. A lot of it's now part of like what's generally considered Little Havana. Riverside was named for the nearby Miami River, and these neighborhoods had a lot of firsts. First hospital, movie theater in the area. So this is around West Flagler Street, if that helps, in downtown Miami. It also was the headquarters of the regional KKK, which was rising in prominence in the 1920s, partly woken up from a very successful movie called Birth of a Nation, which I actually read about in relation to this. So there are also a lot of different places that I talked about in the book that were there as part of this old Jewish downtown. So like there was one that had Shenandoah's candies that were known for its coconut patties and chocolate. And this was fitting as the neighborhood had many coconut palm trees until many died from a disease a decade later. There was Robert Drugs on 6th Avenue in Flagler, and that was like a lunch counter, and that was open until the 1990s. And there was also the Miami Jewish Home, which was founded by someone I mentioned earlier, Ida Cohen, Isidore's wife, so one of the first settlers of the area. Okay, so Temple Beth David, let's do a time check, doing well. So remember I mentioned before about Temple Beth David, and we talked a little bit about it. You guys with me? So now we're going to go a little bit more in depth with that. So this was found, it was founded in the early days, it was the pioneers. It met in the homes of members, and that was very common, right? To not have your own synagogue. Like in New York City, that begins in 1654. The first 23 Jews who arrived for a few decades until they established their own place, especially at New Amsterdam to New York. So here, it was B'nai Zion after Morris Zion, a member who, why do you think it was named after him?
She gave the most money.
Right. You guys are definitely getting it. And so he gave the most money, exactly. And after the death of the member, the congregation realized the needs to have it more formalized. So we talked about all that. So in 1917, I told you it changed to Temple David, and in 1920, they built the first synagogue. But, wait, now we're going on with the story. There's a schism between the conservative and the reform among the members. So what the rabbi did was he introduced what he kind of called a modern conservative approach. So he kind of like mingled the two, if you will. Did that work? Do you think that worked? No, it did not work. So the temple divided. And in 1922, part of the congregation spun off to form what?
Temple Israel.
Temple Israel, exactly. So in 1925, there was another group that spun off to form the Miami Orthodox Congregation, which later became Congregation Bethel. You know that hurricane of 1926 that ravaged the congregation in September, and in 1949, they bought it's where they are today, their current location. So you can read in the book about the ensuing decades, what happened, some of the unique features, like they have a Beck Museum of Judaica with over 500 artifacts. So these are really interesting architecturally and what they have inside, as well as Temple David. Amazing architecture. So I have a lot of pictures of that in the book.
Is this correct, where it says schism between reform and conservative?
Yeah, there was a schism. So that's what I was saying. The
I
rabbi,
didn't even realize there was a reform movement.
Yeah. because the reform movement goes back and started like largely in Cincinnati from a lot of the German Jews. So even in places like in Cincinnati and also in New York and other places, it really before conservative was in many ways a reaction to that and saying that it's going too far and we need to find something in the middle. So it was really in that sequence. So when that was happening and conservatives started to rise in prominence, that's when the congregation said half of them were sort of interested in reform and the other half wanted to change, and that's why it split. So yes. Okay, so I just thought I'd talk about some interesting things that you might not know about. I talk a lot about in the book, but I just tried to find them. So I thought this was kind of cool. This is, do you know about the recorded sound archives on the Boca Raton campus? Yeah, I didn't think you would. So I tried to find things you're not going to know. So this site, I did a lot of, I tried to find like off the beaten path things, and it was sort of an exploratory mission, and I found them. So this one is at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, and it's a recorded sound archives. So it's a digital library of vintage music, and expanded to jazz and early American vintage recordings. And it has a lot of like the old time, like different kinds of klezmer music. So visiting this archive, I interviewed the person in charge of all this. And he said, visiting this archive is more than just taking a trip to a music library. It's a journey to the past. It's hearing vintage sounds as they originally sounded. And here's what I thought was really cool about this. They actually have the players. Like, for example, they have the Edison cylinder player from 1913. And you can listen to these. You can also do it online. So it's a great resource to know about. So they got songs like, How Much Is That Pickle in the Window? And music from like the Newport Folk Festival. They also have the Jewish Print Music Collection, which is from 1897 to the present. So printed materials, I quote from my interview with him, can be a window into the culture, language, and literature of the Jewish diaspora. What they have in this collection is a lot of sheet music. So you know how like sheet music in those days was much more colorful and artistic? It was like crafted. It's sort of like a lost art in a way. So they have that. They've actually taken the time to preserve that. So I wanted to let you know about that. And then there's the Klezmer Company Orchestra, which they call the Shelf to Stage program. So they have tours, they perform at various music festivals, and a lot of them are klezmer songs. But here's the thing I wanted to tell you, and I think you'll find this kind of cool. And this is his word, they're reimagining a lot of these klezmer songs with a, quote, African, Cuban, Caribbean, or Latin beat. Because he sees that as, very typically in South Florida. So why not put the two together? So there's things like 2nd Avenue Mambo, or bongos and bulgars. So he recalibrates it musically to kind of give it this life and then performs it. So I wanted to tell you about that. And then let's just talk about some eateries. So with the assortment of food, there's Cuban, deli, Spanish, Middle Eastern, seafood. So just to kind of, like we talked about in the beginning of this talk, how we want to have like a wider landscape. So this is sort of an example of that. So, in the book I try to talk about some of the different aspects of these food. So, Joe's Stone Crab, have you all eaten there? Yeah, you're pretty familiar with it. But it was started by Joe and Jenny Weiss. And Joe worked for the first casinos. So they left hungry for New York City to work in the restaurant business. Why did Joe come here in the first place?
Because he had asthma.
Right. And the doctor said, as was commonly done then, that they strongly advised him to move to a more favorable climate. And that would be common advice. Like, this was a time when spas were not like we think of spas so much today, but you actually might get that as doctor's advice. Like, you need to go to the spa, you need to have some of this medicinal properties. So it's kind of like along these lines. And I read some of these patient accounts, some of them swear by it. And in certain cases, it did kind of work for them. So Joe came to move to a favorable climate, and he borrows $50 on his life insurance policy, and he came to Miami. Does he feel better in Miami?
No,
Right, he doesn't.
because he didn't feel better till he came across the, not causeway, across the bay to what was then called Ocean Beach.
Exactly. So he did not feel better, but then when he came across here, all of a sudden he could breathe really well. And he decided like maybe this is what he needs to make his living. So he worked in a casino, swimming, card playing. In 1918, Joe and Jenny buy the bungalow near the casino, and they call it Joe's Restaurant. So they served snapper, pompano, mackerel. Did they serve stone crabs?
No.
Not yet, right. And did this do well financially when they first started? Did it do well financially? No? You finally got one wrong. Thank God. You guys are like the most educated audience. I finally stumped you. Oh, you didn't know about the Pleasant one either. No, it did well financially. And the reason is, very simply, there was very little competition. So their costs were low at that time, and it was if you wanted to have like a meal, there weren't that many choices. So Jenny was known to refuse service to customers that she did not like. And I've read accounts that she would see men with their mistresses, and she would kind of like shoo them out. But she kind of had like a special spot for Al Brown. Who's Al Brown?
Al Capone.
Al Capone, right. So Jenny received flowers on Mother's Day with a mysterious message. Good luck, Mother Joe's. So that might have been from Al Capone. I guess we don't really know. Soon after, several years later, stone crabs were added, along with brown potatoes, coleslaw, and mayonnaise. And the patrons absolutely loved them, and they sort of rethought their menu. We thought, oh, maybe we need to concentrate on that. And it's been sort of preserved throughout the decades and varied. So here's just some pictures of it. So I was talking about how they first began, Joe and Jenny Weiss, and some of the early years of it, and then today. So you can kind of like get a sense of it architecturally and how it's changed, and also how it's kind of similar. I mean, like the general outline. So I tried to find like these vintage photos for this. You see like those little signs there. Notice it doesn't say crab, right? It just says Joe's Restaurant at that point.
And actually, they serve right there on the porch, family style.
They serve what?
They serve dinner on the family porch at picnic tables, family style.
Right.
We had dinner there.
Right. So she's saying they served family style on picnic tables, like right
60
up in
years
front.
ago.
60 years ago. Right.
I'm aging myself.
Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about Wolfies. So Wolfie Cohen came from, where was he working before he came here?
In Jacksonville, he was with Levis in Jacksonville. That's where he came from, and he was brought down by Jerry Cohen.
From
He
where?
was not related.
And when he was up north, where did he work? That was a popular resort area. The Catskills, right. So remember, this was like a huge time for the Catskills, and you had a lot of comedy shows and a lot of iconic restaurants. And it was like almost like a whole kind of spectacle, and affordable for middle-class families too. So he was a busboy there, and around 1940 he came to Miami Beach, and he opened his first restaurant, Al's Sandwich Shop, which is on 23rd and Collins. So this is Al's Sandwich Shop, the picture I showed you before. And he became known as the overstuffed sandwich guy. Now, his timing, so remember what I told you before. He's there in the 1940s, he's opening up his first business. Was his timing good or bad to open up his first business?
Good, the earnings.
Right, excellent. So as this gentleman pointed out, it's a great time to open because you have the army base and you have all these potential customers. So in a way, Mr. Wolfie Cohen he got pretty lucky with timing in that respect. And for all these servicemen. And in the 1950s, he also got lucky for another reason. In the 1950s and 60s, delis became quite popular with a lot of the elderly who were living here. So, like Rascal House at Collins and 172nd Street was one. The only thing that needs to come dressed is our chickens, with large Neo sign in the front. It became so sort of iconic that Pan American Airlines served Wolfie's famous cheesecake on flights to New York. He was sort of good with experimenting with these marketing promotional techniques. So what's important about Wolfie is he's sort of bigger than a restaurateur, right? Like we can talk about others who open places, but with him, he was sort of visionary about it. He was a great brander. And he also was good and his staff, at coming up with these sort of marketing gimmicks, some of which were pretty successful. So do any of you know what some of them were? Well, one of them was an early bird menu from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. And it was discounts, and a lot of the seniors at that time liked it. And at Pumpernicks, what famous broadcaster had his first local talk radio?
Larry King.
His first local talk radio show each morning from this location. So that's kind of, now he wasn't that famous necessarily then, but okay. So now I have a very important question. This was featured in what 1980s hit sitcom? If you don't know, then you have to pay $10 fine.
Which one?
Wolfies is referenced, the characters are going to it. Okay, it takes place it was very popular. Everyone watched it.
The Wolfies?
The Gold. So I thought this would be this was one of those shows that, was very popular. It was only when there was 3 networks or whatever. It takes place in Miami, so it was kind of fun because they reference it. So I just wanted to give you that sort of pop culture. So with Wolfies, I saw these pictures. I found these pictures, which you might find interesting. Just take a moment to see some of the neon signs. Again, bigger than a restaurateur. Really, kind of this over-the-top, individualized decor experience. You see some of the signage was very key, font, it's all kind of custom experience. Okay, so now I wanted to just give you some modern delis in case you like that in Fort Lauderdale, right? Because everything we talked about isn't there anymore, unfortunately. So in case you're well, that's kind of sad. What if I want to go to something right now? Well, do you know about the Fort Lauderdale modern delis?
Yes.
Okay. So there's Top Hat, Pumperdale, New York Deli. These are some. The Top Hat, they all kind of have their own little story, which I won't get into all of them. But Top Hat is this whole theme from the 1920s and that top hat theme. So it's a modern place, but it's trying to harken back to those times. The Pumperdale dates back to 1969, recently revamped. And then the New York Deli is sort of New York City nostalgia. Their theme is, here we don't just talk the talk, we serve it up to you with coleslaw. So, kind of some funny stuff. Okay, so then I just wanted to mention a few things about a biography I had, and I'm going to tie it to Paul Kaplan, which a lot of you are very familiar with. So this is a biography that just came out from Pelican that I did on a social and healthcare reformer named Lillian Wald. And I thought about it a little bit for this reason. Barbara Kaplan came in the 1970s, and she, at that point, became a real, in many ways, like an activist for preserving the architecture here and a lot of the Art Deco, which so many of you know, and a lot of you are tour guides and do that work all the time. But she was, in many ways, had to go against the grain. She had to convince. She had to find a way to finance some of this. So I thought it was an interesting sort of tie-in. I mentioned a few things about this person, Lillian Wald. So she revolutionized healthcare. So just like a few things about her. This is in the late 19th century, early 20th century. She was in nursing school, and she thought that it was very stodgy. There was very little care for the patient. She actually became what they call one of the least little-known health, but most important people in terms of what she did. So President Franklin Roosevelt called her, quote, one of the least known yet important people of her time in a 1937 radio address. So she attended nursing school, like I said, and she found it, she dropped out, and then she didn't like that it didn't address a lot of the underlying social ills. So she went to the Lower East Side and she taught a class on hygiene. And there's this famous sort of scene where a girl comes in, can't speak English, imagine this is the densest neighborhood in the world, comes rushing in, takes Wald by the hand, drags her through the crowded neighborhood to an apartment where her mother is basically bleeding to death. And Wald had no idea of the poor conditions of this largely immigrant population. So she decides to devote her life to it, and she does something that is very unusual at the time. So she starts a settlement. What's a settlement? Now,
Social service agency.
that, right, but that what? What makes it different?
The workers live there.
Right. You are such a great audience. They live there. Now this had been done before, but it was rare. Like Henry Hull and the Hull House in Chicago. So it was kind of like that. So
What was the name of it?
this is what eventually would be known as the Henry Street Settlement. And the visiting nurses service. So she lived there amongst the people, and this is just some pictures from the Lower East Side, like to give you some idea. Some of these old pictures, like Jacob Riis. Do you know Jacob Riis?
Yeah.
So again, related to this in terms of some of that preservation work, he wrote a book he wrote like 15 books, but one of them is How the Other Half Lives, and documented a lot of this. And then in this settlement here, she lived there with Mary Brewster, and the operation expanded and took on more nurses, and she was very crafty in how she got donations from an investment banker, Jacob Schiff. What was he known for? What did he do? What did he finance?
Japanese.
He may have. He's most known for Penn Station, which opened in 1910. So he buys for them what is now known as the Henry Street Settlement, which is still there today, as a social services agency and the visiting nurses service. So it becomes apparent that the health problems are just symptoms, but they're not the causes. So they became experts in other areas, but they quickly needed to learn in order to make that change. So what I thought was interesting was there was no real health insurance. They partnered with MetLife. The antecedent to the NAACP was born in the dining room of the Henry Street Settlement. There's so many things that we think about today that even affect what we're talking about before in terms of racial integration. Started there. There's also moral choices, which we mentioned a little before. The nurses were also about labor and union rights, because this was a time of very terrible labor conditions, when there were like practically no rights for the worker. This was the Gilded Age. So there were many who would knock on their door and they'd say, I don't have health problems, but I'm being exploited in my sweatshop and I need some kind of union representation. So it became an area for that, but in doing so, lost a lot of donors. Because at that time, a lot of big-time donors would say, oh, well, I'll give money for healthcare, but I'm not giving money for for unions. So, you know, these are like the moral choices. And I bring that up because even like a nonprofit, like, there's always going to be these kinds of like questions you have to balance. There were education classes, the Grand Street Playhouse, if you know that. So it was about seeing like the arts in someone. And also very much about child exploitation. So you probably know like the Newsies from that Broadway musical, but it was a lot of kids at the time would drop out of school. And so they would work in sweatshops with their family. So it was, she started this, this bureau to protect them. And this is where like school nurses came into play, school lunches, playgrounds, and a big part of the women's suffrage movement. Now, what is the connection between World War I and the women's suffrage movement, do you think? The passage of the women's suffrage movement. The connection, and I read in some primary sources, is it became another argument. Like women would say, you could vote somewhere, but I mean as a constitutional amendment, would say, well, I have no say in whether or not we go to war, and you can take my son or my husband, but I can't even vote. And that was one of the many things that kind of gave sympathy towards this very important cause, which really started in the mid-19th century. So just, you know, wanted to give you a sense of that and kind of make some ties here with this book here. Okay, so now I will turn it over to you for some Q&A. Let me know if you have any, just raise your hand if you have any questions about anything we talked about, Florida, the wall stuff, anything at all. Yes?
Where was that Utopia settlement you're talking about?
Oh, Utopia settlement, and someone actually told me in another talk that there's still a sign there. It's in, I don't know, it's in kind of like the central part. What's that? And have you actually been there?
Where?
Yes.
Micanopy?
Are there any archaeological remains of it?
Yeah, that's a good. So someone told me when I did a talk at the Jewish Museum of Florida that they went there and saw that there is some kind of like marker there, but very little.
There's a state marker,
State.
and there are remains of David Levy Yulee's sugar mill in Homosassa.
Okay, great, thank you. The sugar mill, David Levy's sugar mill. That's a great question. Any other questions? Yeah.
I want to thank you for not bringing up the most ridiculous and nonsensical total myth of Miami Beach, that Jews could not buy property north of 5th Street till after 1920. That is total, unadulterated nonsense. And there were plenty of hotels that were very pleased to accept Jews. There were a limited number. As far as the blacks, remember, Florida was a segregated state, Jim Crow. There were no signs that said no blacks. Blacks just simply were not allowed by law. So there was no need for signs. And I would suggest, young man, that you come and see me, because this is the first ever history of our people in Miami. And you don't have one mention of it in your book. And I have the largest private collection of Jewish Miami memorabilia in America, and the largest collection of restricted clientele memorabilia in the country in public or private hands. So when you're ready for a revision, as the great line goes, you come on up and see me sometime.
What's your name?
I'll let the folks tell you their name.
Oh, okay, yeah, I read through it's Seth Branson. If you look at the sources here, I have, I think, one or two of the books that you wrote that I used as sources, and it's cited. So both in the endnotes and also in the reference section. For any like direct quotes that I took. Anyone else? Anything at all? Any of these topics? Okay, I'll start here. Yeah.
So David Levy actually, yes, he was born Jewish, but by the time he became senator, he had married, taken the name Yulee, so David Levy Yulee, and converted to Christianity.
He never converted. His family was raised Christian, he never converted.
Yeah. From what I read, so Yulee, and perhaps for political reasons and for trying, being more aligned with like some of the agricultural Southern interests. Like, certainly he has the identities and go by. What's interesting with all this is though it's in such marked contrast to his father. But then it sort of makes sense because he was in politics, and the other was more sort of this utopian figure. Yeah? Okay, you do it.
Okay, thank you. One question I have is the Sephardic Jews that you mentioned, did most of them come from the islands, like from St. Thomas, Curacao, where the first Jewish congregation started?
So,
Could you repeat the question or the comment?
Yes, you're asking where the first Sephardic Jews came from here. So I think we see a number of different things. Some came from the Caribbean and other areas like that, in Cuba, and some of them, as we know from the synagogue, they came from Spain and Turkey. Maybe not directly here. There was sort of like a detour, but some came directly from those countries. Yeah.
Yes, I also understand that a lot of Sephardic Jews went from Spain to Turkey after the Inquisition.
Sure. Yeah. So, we're talking about the Inquisition in 1492. So you have a few centuries where they went many different places. So some went to Turkey, but some went to other places in the Ottoman Empire, perhaps where they could became the Ottoman Empire. They went places, and then some came to Latin America. Some went to Brazil, and then some ended up in North America for different reasons. And many went to the Caribbean too, which was a very thriving area in the late 19th century. There's a lot of rum and a lot of goods that were made there. So the answer to your question is yes, from there, via these other places, and ended up at different points in North America. So I want to thank you very much. You've been a great audience.
Thank you, Paul. And for those of you who are here, please consider buying Paul's book. So he's going to go now over to the museum, the other side of the museum. And thanks again for coming. And our next lecture is May 16th with Mr. Joel Levine, Lost Treasures of Sunny Isles. Thank you.